Okay, it was a 1.
A 1. Okay, Audrey, the topic you and your die have chosen for us to discuss today is how much and what kind of preparation do you do before running a role-playing game?
Hello, and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about running role-playing games. Each episode, our guest rolls on our table of topics, and we discuss the result. My name is Chris Salzman.
I'm Andy Rao.
And this week, we're joined by special guest, Audrey Huggett.
Hi!
Welcome.
I'm happy to be here.
So I am going to ask you about the die that you just rolled. So it looked pretty massive from what we saw of it. I guess, where did you get that?
It was a Christmas gift for my brother. He got me a giant dice set for Christmas one year. This is my, dramatic moment dice, right?
Yeah.
Something big is happening, so you have to pull out the big dice.
Is it one of those metal ones that, actually dents your table when you roll?
No, it's definitely plastic. It looks like a Chessex dice, but it's giant, so I don't know where he got it from. I think it had a wrapper, but I was so excited about it, I was immediately like, ah! And, it was gone.
So you got connected with us through the library. So a librarian there reached out and said, hey, you need to talk with Audrey. She's super great. And so you've written actually a couple of games for the library.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay. Yeah, so why don't you tell me a little bit about those?
Sure. So the library games kind of started as me thinking, how can we... Okay, so this is also, a secret. So, audience, never tell anyone about this. Mm-hmm. The idea, the genesis for my programs is, how can we do role-playing in the library? But I don't like putting role-playing on my, program descriptions, because I think there are still people out there who immediately go, role-playing is for nerds, or whatever. I don't like calling them role-playing games, but they are definitely, absolutely out of an attempt for me to be how do we get this into the library? The library I work for, the Ann Arbor District Library, is a interesting library because we don't do reservations, basically ever. So our programs can have anywhere from 5 to 500 people show up. So a big part of this planning this was figuring out how I could build a program for people that would scale. So the first one I came up with was a murder mystery because the role that people are inhabiting when they come into it is detective. And it's a concept that people get. If I say it's a murder mystery party, you kind of know what that means. So I wrote a murder mystery for the library and basically made this case file. You could pick it up the week before the program. You could read all the interviews with all the suspects. And then people on the day of showed up and you had an hour as an audience to basically have a panel Q&A with all the suspects, which were my coworkers. And prepping them was actually really similar to prepping players for role-playing because, there's no way to, predict what questions people were going to ask. So when I was, prepping my coworkers, I was here's your character, here's your motivations,
And did they get into it?
Yeah, they totally did. The library is a really amazing place to work. One of my players from my game she actually ended up being the murderer. So she knew how to role-play. We have an amazing story team. So, everyone just, they killed it. And they did so good. They came up with stuff that I never would have thought of. It was, so cool to watch. I was also in the back the entire time being because I was just watching it happen. Being hopefully this works. Was
the entire audience all trying to solve it at the same time?
Yeah. Yeah. So then
so how many people did you have, then?
We had 120.
Okay.
Wow.
That's frightening.
Yeah. I was in the back, literally freaking out the entire time. Especially because, the first question that got asked, it was, the solution. And I was they can't ask that question yet! But it was, a family, and the kids, talked themselves out of it, I think, which was a bummer. But so after the panel, there's, a half an hour break, and people had, 10 minutes to submit their answer. And then on a Google form, and then I, looked at all the answers, or pulled out all the people that had got the right answer, and then we randomly selected winners. We had a little scene where we announced who the murderer was. So that was the murder at Raccoon Ranch.
That's super fun. Do you think you'll ever get to run that again? Is that going to be a yearly thing?
Yeah, so this October, the Saturday before Halloween, is the next one. It doesn't have a title yet because I haven't written it yet. Both of my programs are going to be yearly things. After Raccoon Ranch, I basically went to my boss and was hey, this was actually a beta program for this thing I actually want to do. And look how well it worked. And he was like, okay, like, let's see what you can do. So in the spring, I ran a program called the In-Between Quest for the Keystone. This program is like way more intense and involved, and that's my fantasy program. And basically like the homework or like whatever thing that people pick up is the Explorer Journal. It explains what the In-Between is. And the In-Between is like this world that exists kind of in between all the other worlds that can possibly exist, where like people fall into, sometimes they leave, sometimes they stay. And like the thing holding it in place gets like disappeared. So it's starting to like crash into the library. There are two options. You can make either another keystone, restore it to what it is, or you can make a through line and like it will turn into something else. So when people showed up, there were 6 different like little things they could do to get knowledge tokens. Once they got enough knowledge tokens, they could buy these magic words that they then had to like solve the thing for, which gave them the words to create a through line or keystone. And then we had like another thing where people submitted what they put their magic words in. And then we announced what the solution was. And people chose to make a keystone. So the In-Between is like put back together. And we had like, you know, a big scene revealing it. The story I'm making next spring is like based off of that. And like so now we're at this place. And moving forward, the story moves forward.
That's super cool. Yeah, we'll drop links into the actual like the PDFs that you handed out. But the one for the Quest for the Keystone, I mean, this just reminds me of like Myst.
Yeah.
Totally. Like I don't know if you were looking at that at all, but
it's definitely an inspiration because me and my dad played that when I was little, and so like it was like it was like such a good memory and like it's like the only video game I've ever really played.
Yeah, you and a lot of other people, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, is this all original stuff that you are coming up with on the fly? Are you basing the program on a model that somebody else has tried, or are you spearheading this?
I'm just making it up.
That is really impressive. It sounds really elaborate, like terrifyingly elaborate, honestly.
Yeah, the Keystone, I had way more composure for the Keystone because I was like in character, being observer kind of character, but like definitely in the murder mystery, if someone had like looked to the back of the audience, they would have seen me in the back just gripping my face, like freaking out literally the entire time. One of my coworkers was there and I was like, just like hanging onto her arm the entire time, and she's like, it's fine.
You know, something you mentioned at the beginning, a little thing, was how you introduced the idea, how you sold people on the idea by using murder mysteries as a common reference. You can say it's kind of like a murder mystery. You know, it just makes me think of all of the times that I've been called to answer the question of like, what is this D&D thing, or what is this role-playing thing? And you say, oh, it's like cops and robbers, or it's like make believe, but there's some rules, or things like that. But or maybe like it's like World of Warcraft, except it's not at a computer. And I don't know, that murder mystery is actually kind of a good good thing to think about using.
Yeah, that was honestly kind of my segue into role playing. I'd written a murder mystery for some friends that was just really fun, but it's also so much work.
Yeah.
So like running role playing games in some ways almost easier than doing sort of all that prep work, because like the murder mystery sort of hangs on that one revelation, and that's really got to get sold well. Whereas with role playing, like you can kind of have many different resolutions in there.
Yeah, you can fudge it a little more with role playing. With this murder mystery, I was like, they have to be able to figure it out, right?
Yeah. So I guess what's your interest in? I guess obviously like games are fun, right? But like, why do you think that it's important that the library or libraries do things like this?
So I guess it kind of like is part of why I think role-playing games are important in general. Like, there's a couple different reasons. Like, an obvious one being, like, it's imaginative, it's a storytelling experience. But I think on a more important level, like, role-playing games give you a space to, like, try new things. And in particular, they give you, like, a space to fail that often feels safe because, like, even if your character dies, it's just a character and you can make a new one, and like you can make a story out of the death. Like that becomes like a thing itself too often. I think that like role-playing games are like really important because they give you a safe space to just experiment with different ways of being in the world, like it just interacting with people. So it was something I thought was important to bring to the library because it's on a smaller scale because you can't get the intimacy that you get with like 5 other people or 3 other people, but it still is a place to like experience failure, which sounds really weird.
No, not at all. That's fascinating, actually. Has running games and running programs like this at the library, has it affected the way you either run games or you play games when it's just you and your friends sitting down to play D&D and let's go hit up the dungeon?
So I am just now preparing to run a one-shot sort of setting, so I haven't run a full game since doing these programs. But in terms of playing, since I've like articulated the thought of failure to myself, I think I'm more thoughtful about like the things I'm experimenting with my characters. And then like the other thing that's like kind of unrelated is I work with a lot of talented people, and like the level of commitment they brought to their characters was super inspiring. So like I feel like I'm a better role player for having watched my like coworkers do this thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So hey, shall we skip into the topic that we rolled and see where that takes us? So the topic that Audrey rolled was how much preparation and what type of preparation, or what preparation at all, do you do when you're getting ready to run a game? And this was a topic that was introduced several episodes ago by John Corey, I believe. Why don't we start with Chris? Why don't you give us a little snapshot of what you do to prepare to run a game session?
This is a very timely question. So as I mentioned, I think on the last episode, I'm transitioning into a new campaign. Well, same campaign, but we're transitioning into Hoard of the Dragon Queen. So it's a new book, essentially, right? A new module. Yeah. So I'm kind of faced with the, like, how should I prep appropriately? And I guess what I've learned thus far is that I have a tendency to over prep, to the point where things don't go my way, then I'm not really sure what else to do. So with this one, I'm going to try to just have like a better idea of sort of the broad brushstrokes of sort of the whole kind of campaign, you know, start to finish, and then just kind of let things happen a bit more. So treat it a bit like a sandbox, but also have some rails that I can kind of jump back to as needed. That said, so for individual sessions, when we actually meet, my prep is pretty light. I actually kind of shift a lot of the, like, hey, what happened last week sort of prep into the session itself. So I ask the players to sort of recap it for me. And then from there, we just sort of, you know, we go off, you know, so I might have a couple notes. For the most part, I try to not do too much prep, just because I'll get too into my head, I think. Or I do get into my head when I do that. Yeah. What about you, Andy?
Well, my main goal in preparing is to identify the stuff that will bog down the game or trip me up, and try and take care of it in advance. So usually that is rules stuff. I'm not the biggest rules rememberer, despite, you know, GMing for years. But I really hate having to stop the game and look something up in a rule book. If I'm running a published adventure, I hate having to flip through it to find the stats for something, or to refresh my memory about what treasure was in such and such a room. So I do a lot of writing because that's how my brain remembers stuff. So I will just go through the exercise of writing down any rule stuff that I think I'm likely to need that I don't have internalized. So that's monster powers and spells, and if I know characters are likely to use certain powers or certain moves in combat that I don't know super well, like whatever, the grappling rules or something, I will reread and jot those down on a note card or something. And I don't do a whole lot of prep centered around like the story, because I'm usually okay at rolling with what the players do story-wise. I just want to be sure that whatever they do, I am not the person pausing the game to look up the rules. So that means a lot of different things depending on what game I'm going to be running and what the story is.
Do you find that when you actually sit and write down sort of those mechanics and things like that, that then you don't actually need the reference?
Yeah, but it helps my confidence. You know, it just helps me feel a little bit more prepared, even if I don't ever have to check whatever the spell resistance DC of something. I know that it's there, you know, and I tend to prepare more than is probably needed in that respect. But
if you encounter sort of a mechanical question with the rules, will you ever just sort of make up something on the fly, or do you always have to have a reference that you go back to? Yes.
So because of my irrational fear of stopping the game while I flip through the index of a 350-page book, I much prefer to just make something up on the fly rather than stop and look it up. It's usually not too hard in D&D because it uses a basic system for resolving most challenges, right? So I just come up with a quick variant on it and we move on. but I don't like being inconsistent over time. So if that does happen, I'll make a mental note of it, and then the next game I will come with the real rule prepared. And I might occasionally have to say, okay, last week we did the grapple rules this way, but I checked and it's actually this other way. So I don't want people to feel like the rules are changing on them, on my whim from game to game.
Mm-hmm. So Audrey, when you have to play a game with less than 120 people, how do you prep?
Yeah, one of the topics on our table of topics, by the way, is like preparing games for large groups of players. And I think you are the undisputed master of that particular topic. But
yeah, our low estimate for the in-between was 140, so...
Yeah, okay.
Just bragging a little bit.
I cap my games at 6 players, so...
It's fair.
Yeah, I mean, people get impressed when, like, Gygax ran games for, 15 people. But, whoa, that has been surpassed, everyone.
Yeah, so when I'm running for a smaller group of people, I guess it's, an answer that I'm still finding the right thing for me about. I've only been DMing for, 3 years. 3 years now. And when I started DMing, it was the first time I played Dungeons and Dragons. So I was actively learning the rules as I DM'd.
Yeah.
For that particular campaign, it went for a year and a half. And I was doing all sorts of crazy, different types of prepping because I was trying to figure out what worked for me. I ended up getting really in my, the sessions where I prepped a lot, especially from a book, I would get really in my head about it. Moving forward, I think what I will prefer to do is spend a lot of time on the situation of the world, and then as the players move through it, if I'm prepping anything, it's stuff that's happening off stage, and then letting the players interact with the world as it comes. So not as much prepping besides probably some loot tables. And I should probably be better. I'm really bad at prepping monsters.
Yeah.
So I'm always what can they do? And not utilizing them super well.
Have you read Dungeon World at all? That rule set?
I haven't.
Dungeon World might be something to look at if you want to do some of that world state sort of stuff instead of having specific scenarios. Because there's a lot of emphasis put on you create sort of these fronts in the world that are up to something. They have kind of goals of their own, and they can kind of just run in the background.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, it's kind of an interesting way of approaching it, because I think D&D is very much focused on the you have a written module or you write it out yourself, and then everything's sort of written out. Whereas with Dungeon World and some other games, it can be a little bit more fuzzy,
for sure,
to say the least.
Have you guys ever run a game with zero prep, and a game that's not intended to be run with zero prep?
I think there was one session of my campaign. I don't remember what happened, but I basically went in cold. And actually, I think it ended up going super well because this is why I'm switching to prepping like this. It was a module that I had written myself. So I had all the background knowledge in my brain and knew kind of what was going on. My characters were at that point were level 6-ish. So no one was no one's abilities were crazy. No one had backflipping and fireballing at the same time sort of abilities yet. So it was much easier to manage. It actually went super well. I think because I had no preset expectations. I think part of what over prepping would trip me up on was I would get this idea of how things needed to go, and then when the characters didn't do that, you kind of react by trying to clamp down, or I reacted by clamping down and trying to control things. So when I didn't prep, I think it actually ended up being super fun.
I ran a session one time where only 2 players could make it, and we almost canceled. And I was like, well, let's just meet and we'll do something. And so we did a flashback, and it ended up being great. I didn't have anything prepared, so I just kept asking them questions over and over. So this is in D&D, right? And so we were just asking questions. You developed this whole kind of flashback scene that they both participated in. And it ended up being I think one of my highlights of the past probably year of gaming, just looking back on that. And it created some interesting story hooks for the rest of the campaign, and just all this stuff came out of it. But it was only by kind of saying yes to the well, I don't know what's going to happen, let's just see. Yeah, and the guy who added this to the table, John Corey, like this is just how he runs games. Like he doesn't do any prep. He does a game which I'm really hoping to get to play in at some point where he just does a Mad Lib at the start of the game and then they just take it from there.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
That's very impressive. So both of you guys mentioned in your answers that it was like a positive experience when you had to run with zero prep. I mean, did it cross your mind to think, hey, like from now on, I'm just not going to prep. Like this is the way to do it. Or did you think, well, that was great, but never again?
I did think that. And I did way less prep for the rest of that like segment of the campaign. But then we segued into Curse of Strahd. And because it was from a module, I put this like weird pressure on myself. I was like, I need to memorize the entire 300-page book to run this properly, which feels like a very beginner mistake, which is probably what it was. Because, like, I had run Mines of Phandelver, which was, like, nice and little, very manageable, and then, like, Strahd, I was like, I need to know everything, and you can't. So I, like, did the right thing and then immediately unlearned it.
Yeah, I contemplated it briefly. I think... So the main game that I run is this lunch game, and I feel a certain amount of pressure to make sure that that's enjoyable for everybody. And to me, the way to do that is to just, have a module.
Yeah.
But, I mean, like, there's no real reason, I guess, why we couldn't. So I've experimented a little bit with this with one-shots and things like that. And then Andy and I are playing a Blades in the Dark game here and there. And that I'm trying to keep as low prep as possible. And that's just totally like, whatever they're going to do, I'll just react to it and we'll sort of see what happens. That system is designed around that philosophy. Whereas D&D, I feel like just isn't, because like you mentioned, Audrey, like getting monsters and stuff built up, like I can't imagine how I would just roll with that for a whole campaign. I guess you'd come up with tools and tricks, but...
Yeah, well, the module, or not module, but like the campaign I had written was actually a murder mystery, sort of. It was based on Jack the Ripper, and there was like a cult involved, but like there was a lot of like the players having to like figure out what was going on, so it was more role-playing heavy than like monster heavy. I knew what the end monster was, so like there were only a couple that they were going to interact with, so I didn't have to like have them this whole compendium of monsters memorized.
One thing that playing Blades of the Dark with you, Chris, and some others has helped me to understand is that part of reducing your own prep is being confident that your players are going to step forward and help pick up the slack if you're not filling in all of the details. And that's a really liberating thing to play with a group of players that is proactive. And I think most players are like this. They want to step up and participate and kind of drive the story. And there's something kind of refreshing in the idea of like, I'm going to worry a little less about preparing everything, and I'm going to let my players take the reins a little bit more and see where they take it.
Yeah, there was a podcast that you had mentioned to me, Andy, Neoscum, I think. And in that, there is a GM, I think. I don't quite know right now, but they're playing
Shadowrun, I think.
Oh yes, Shadowrun. They're playing Shadowrun, and the players actually also play some of the NPCs in the game. So like as they're sort of talking and stuff, like an NPC will show up, and like one of the players just sort of takes that NPC and does their character in an NPC, and that to me just seems really like kind of a fascinating thing, because there's, at least in D&D, you get very into the like, you have the dungeon master, you have the players, and there's like a clear separation, but there's no real reason why like a player couldn't run that shopkeeper. Like that shopkeeper might not have any special knowledge about the story that they can't possibly know, but they could interact with other players. So that's something that I think I want to try at some point, is to hand over control of some of those kind of side characters to players as well. Yeah,
that's a really interesting idea. I think it's like scary for the same reason that you would want to like have all the prep, which is like you're giving control of the thing to someone else.
Like, what if they're better at it than you are?
Yeah. Or what if they're like, we pile our merchandise in the middle of the room and light it on fire? Like probably they won't do that, but who knows?
It depends on your players. I guess you got to know them.
Yeah.
There's a famous, like, it's not an urban legend because it's a true story, but if you poke around on the internet, you'll find this account of a first edition Warhammer campaign, the Warhammer fantasy role-playing game, where the players are supposed to be investigating this Byzantine, this labyrinth of corruption and betrayal, and instead, at the first town, they buy a barge and they set up this merchant job just transporting goods from city to city. And when you let your players take the reins a little bit more, you do run the risk of those ludicrous moments like that. But those are also make for really fun experiences too. So
for the end of that campaign, there was everyone had to go down into the sewers to rout out the snake people scourge. They managed to persuade the City Watch to join them, so I made City Watch characters, and then was you all have to also play your NPC buddy in this fight, because I'm not making combat something where it's me fighting myself for literally half of it. That sounds terrible. And one of the characters that I made, his name was Sean Onions, and my players became obsessed with Sean Onions. He was going to get married to Fiona. What was her last name? It was Fiona Radish. They became invested in him making it out alive, to the point where they used a healing potion on him when he went down, so that he could make it to his wedding when they escaped the sewer. They made up a whole backstory for this guy. They did not care anything about any of the other people. They're they're fine, but Sean Onions was their guy.
So when you guys were starting GMing, how did you learn how to prepare for a game? What I mean by that is, had you watched somebody else GMing, and did you learn from them, here's what I do to get a game ready? Or were you just reading straight out of the Dungeon Master's guide of what to do, or winging it? How did you guys figure out, how did you come to the place where you are now?
There's a guy on YouTube, Matt Colville, who does a series.
He's so good. Sorry.
Yeah, he does a series of videos about running the game, and those were really helpful, I think, in the beginning for me to watch some of that. But I think also, Andy, we could probably dig through our emails, and you could probably get the late night ramblings from me trying to put together my first session, asking you questions about super basic stuff. Yeah, and I don't know, it's weird because I hadn't really played too many games, and I actually had never played D&D before I'd played D&D. I'd played Pathfinder, once or twice or so, so I didn't really have a model to go after other than sort of a general sense of a couple things I wanted to accomplish at the table. But other than that, it was just trying to prep as much as possible, and then you hit that first session and realize that you get through 1/10 of it, if that.
When I was starting GMing, it was back in the day, and there was an attitude about GMs that was at least articulated differently than games do today, and it tended to take the GMing role, I guess, I don't want to say more seriously, because we take GMing seriously today, but to put more responsibility on the GM personally for making sure the game ran smoothly than you might find in a game today, where there's a little bit more expectation that everybody is participating equally. So yeah, I went through a while of way over preparing, because that's what the book said I had to do, and the book also said that it was my fault if things went awry. And it took quite a while, because I was the only person I knew who GM'd. It took quite a while for me to realize, yeah, it's actually okay if I don't know all of this stuff going in. How about you, Audrey? How did you figure this out?
So the role-playing game I played before D&D, I played a campaign in GURPS in college, and I was a super nerd, so I played with 2 of my college professors and 2 other students. The benefits of going to a small college. And Ian was a great DM, and so I knew it could be done, but it didn't occur to me to ask him for help 4 years later when I started being a GM. So the internet is who I turned to. So that's how I found Matt Colville. He had really recently started his video series, so I caught up really fast. There's a lot of information, but it was also kind of overwhelming. A lot of it was also just trial and error on my own, at least initially. And then the other thing that I stumbled into when I became a GM was our local game shop, where I hit it up with one of the employees, and we became friends because basically I would come in and find him and be like, this is how my campaign is going, and he would tell me about his campaign. So then we started meeting up, and we call with another friend, and we called it DM therapy. So we'd get together and talk about what was going on in our campaign, and
that's amazing.
And we only did it a couple times, but it was super helpful to talk to other people. The same thing started happening to me, where I would get in my head and be like, it's my responsibility for everyone to have a good time. Even though the internet said otherwise, people around me said otherwise, but it was still helpful to be able to talk to someone else who was Yeah, people sometimes just get on their phone. It's okay.
So how much preparation do you guys do, would you say? For a typical, you've got game night coming up, and you're going to be playing for like 3 to 5 hours or something. How much time do you guys spend getting ready for that?
So I think this answer is going to change with my campaign coming up because I'm writing it. I've found that what works for me, I think, like, kind of what I mentioned earlier is, like, making the whole world and then, like, letting it go. And once I put that initial front-loaded, I built the thing, time in, I don't have to prep right beforehand as much. And when I was doing that for the Snake Cult campaign, I could get away with, like, half an hour to an hour of prep, and it was, like, fine. And it was just me, like, going over, like, probably where they would go, and then, like, just making sure I didn't need to, like, look at monster stats or something before.
Yeah, so for prep for me, so with the lunch game that I run, prep is really honestly like 10 or 15 minutes beforehand, just making sure I have sort of everything in hand, and then just hit the ground running. For the Blades in the Dark game, it's probably going to be the same, like 15 to 30 minutes. Like, I do a lot of prep at the front, thinking through things and getting things set up and making sure the players are the right players for whatever we're doing. And then from there, we can kind of take it and run. I guess another piece of that, so I've run one-shots, and with one-shots, I will prep a lot more for those than I will for a typical session. I do feel like a strong sense of this has to be worth it for the people who are playing in a one-shot, whereas with a campaign, it's like you can rely on them to sort of pick up the slack here and there. But if I'm going to invite a bunch of people who are playing one game for 3 hours and we might never play ever again, it's like it's got to be good. That might be, for a 3-hour session, that might be a 5 to 10 hour prep.
I've found that more of my prep time in the last couple of years is taken up with preparing things like maps and stuff for the players, and picking out miniatures or printing out little, printing out NPC photos, things like that. I still do plenty of let's get the goblin stats written down, but a little less of that and a little bit more, what can I do so that, this is a visually compelling experience as well. Do you guys do much stuff like that in your game?
Not a ton. I'm starting to use miniatures more, mostly because my players want to use them. So I think at some point I'm going to have to start, busting out the paint set and painting little plastic figurines. But for now, I'm just using pennies and pieces of paper and quickly drawn maps and things like that. I don't think I'll ever get down to the point where I'm using like a grid and drawing everything to scale.
If I'm going to be running a dungeon, like a self-enclosed dungeon, and the adventure is not likely to range too far from that, I do like drawing out a map. I think they're a local group in West Michigan that make these like rolls of grid paper. I love just the like tactile experience of unfurling that, and I have drawn at least a rough layout of the dungeon on it for players to fill in as they travel. I love just unrolling that in front of everybody. It feels like Gandalf unrolling the map to Smaug's lair or something like that. But that takes, that can take a fair amount of time, so I definitely don't always do that. But.
You sound like a better GM than I am.
Yeah, right.
I haven't done a big map, but for one dungeon, I did like the whole grid layout of it, and like we used like the D4 to like mark where the characters were. Like the only other thing was like one time I needed like a prop because someone was like giving someone something, so I like wrote out the letter, lit that corner on fire or whatever, and then like made it look all distressed and gave it to them. So that was the only other time I like really put a lot of like effort into like, here's the thing. How
about, do you guys do a lot of in-between game interaction with players? Like, do you have bookkeeping that you do in between games? Are you emailing people to tell them their XP and to discuss with them what they're doing in between adventures, or do you pretty much radio silence until game night?
Somewhat. If there's a rules thing that's easier to handle, over email or honestly Slack these days, it's just, sometimes we'll do that. But for the most part, it's just radio silence. Mostly because, like, if we're going to play the game, I'd rather just play the game then, not in fits and starts throughout the week.
Yeah, if there's, like, a character background thing that might affect the story, I would definitely, like, text that person. Otherwise, it's pretty, like, radio silence, unless someone is, like, texting me, harassing me about whatever happened last week.
Do you do that, Andy? Do you keep up with people?
Not too much, but it's partly because I'm kind of a disorganized person that forgets to do this. For one of the games I run intermittently, I have a private Facebook group that gets used to post occasional, like, here's what's going on, here's a reminder of what happened last session, and that takes a little bit of time to write up, but it's not a significant time investment. I do kind of like the idea of, especially since I tend to run games separated by a couple of weeks, it's not like a daily or weekly thing. So I do think that in theory it would be really nice to be checking in with everybody periodically in between game sessions. But in reality, I forget to do that and get busy, and then it doesn't happen. So, but that's sort of an aspirational.
Fair.
There's a Slack channel for my lunch game, and they've recently started trying to discuss some like tactics and strategy beforehand. And it takes a lot for me not to jump in there and be like, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's
man.
like a gold.
Or
mine.
like, okay, great. I guess I'm going to have to shift this whole.
Yeah.
My players started a group chat that specifically didn't have me on it at one point because they wanted to like discuss tactics and like didn't want me to know. Yeah, the snake cult and then Strahd like really got to them.
All right, well, I think we should wrap things up here. We've said kind of a lot about preparation and our lack thereof. Here and there. It's the dirty secret of all GMs is they want to prep more than they do.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Audrey, so we've talked about this topic, and what we'd love to do is replace this with another topic. Mm-hmm. So if you have anything that you want to add so some other poor soul has to talk about, we can add it to the list.
Yeah, I have an idea, which is my favorite thing to talk about, which is monsters, like how you use them. I just like monster manuals are my favorite thing because I think it's really easy to build adventures off of monsters, and also like who doesn't have a favorite monster?
So Audrey, I've got to ask, do you do the thing when you acquire a purchased module of any sort of flipping to the end to see what like the monster at the end is?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm like straight to the monsters. I will flip through the book too because they do have the stats all at the end now. But I like flipping through because they have the adventure pictures, and I like looking at those and seeing what monsters they have in those. So yes, absolutely.
Excellent. All right, well, yeah, we'll add that to the table. And Audrey, do you have a lot going on with your library programs and whatnot? Do you have anything that you want to plug or mention that you can either mention here or we'll put in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all library stuff. So Murder Mystery Part 2 is going to be in October. The in-between Part 2 is going to be in the spring sometime. I don't have an official date yet. I got the library. I'm a librarian, and I got money to start an RPG manual collection. So that's going to drop into the library probably late June. If you live in the Ann Arbor area, come check it out, because if you guys check out books, I'll be able to get more books.
Well, if it helps, I had Hoard of the Dragon Queen checked out for like 3 months. So
that was me too. I was like, we need to have D&D books in our collection. They're so expensive. And it worked. And in September 14th, my coworker and I are talking about doing an RPG day at the library. So it'll be like a bunch of little basically the chance to come in and try different RPG systems with different GMs. And paint your own miniature.
Sounds almost like a miniature convention.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were aiming for. But our library does a bunch of huge events, so we were like, we're very committed to this being like a medium-sized event instead of like gigantic.
Well, that's spectacular. Where would someone go to find out what programs are going on in the Ann Arbor area? For
the library specifically, aadl.org. We've got an events page that has all of our big stuff coming up, or our Facebook page. Or Instagram page.
I should have asked this earlier, but do you have people, speaking of library events, do you have people coming in and like reserving space in the library to run their own games?
Not right now that I know of. We only have a couple rooms that people can like book like that. We are working on expanding spaces like that to all of our branches. So when Mallett's Creek opens up, which is one of our branches, it's reopening after being under construction for a couple weeks. That's going to have bookable meeting rooms in it, and we're working on bringing that to all of the branches. So I think the goal is after like the end of 2019, maybe 2020, all of the library branches should have bookable rooms if people want to use the library for that purpose.
That's super great. Yeah, I'm excited for that September event. Hopefully that happens.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
We're working on partnering with Volta Midnight, so we're just starting to plan it, but it'll come together.
Yes. Yeah, of course. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was really delightful. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Yeah, that would be great. I had a great time.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like a threat when Chris says it like that.
You will be required. No, if you want to, you can come back sometime.
You've been a guest once. You must always return.
Yes. All right, well, thank you so much. I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rao.
Remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.